Hi guys, Olive here. Here today with the next installment in my ongoing series of videos all about the 90s PBS Kids TV show, Wishbone. Just in case you've never seen or heard of the show, it was a half-hour television program for children, and each episode had two different storylines. The first storyline was always an adaptation of a work within the literary canon, and then the other storyline was a modern, aka 1990s storyline that focused mainly on a family living in Texas with their pet Jack Russell Terrier, and that modern storyline always related back to the work of literature that they were focusing on. In this series of videos I do here on my channel, I look at one episode of Wishbone per video, and I compare it against its source material, whatever literary work they decided to take on in that episode. I look at what they chose to include, what they chose to exclude, why they may have made those choices. I look to see if they pulled any kind of moral message out of the source material to communicate to the very young audience of this show. And at the end of the day, I'm looking to see whether or not it made an entertaining episode of television. In today's video, we will be looking at a late season 1 episode of Wishbone that takes on Mark Twain's classic switcheroo tale, The Prince and the Pauper. It's an episode titled The Prince and the Pooch. Let's take a look. What's the story, Wishbone?
What's the story, Wishbone? What's this you're dreaming of?
This episode begins with the happy realization that spring has finally arrived in Oakdale, Texas. The kids are throwing around a baseball when Joe starts complaining that his basketball team could have gone all the way this past season if only they had a better coach. When Joe tells David's dad that he, Joe, could have done a lot better as the coach of the team, Joe gets the chance to prove it, since David's dad offers him a temporary assistant coach gig for David's little sister Emily's t-ball team. And so the player becomes the coach, and this role reversal leads Wishbone to introduce this episode's source material, The Prince and the Pauper, which is set in 16th century London during the reign of King Henry VIII. This story stars two young boys, and in this episode, they're both played by Wishbone. One is a poor boy named Tom, who has a very hard life. His daily life includes a lot of hardships, but his life includes a lot more freedom and fun than the son of the king, the Prince of Wales, the other boy in this story, who wants for nothing but whose life is very confined. When they meet by chance, these two realize that they look a lot alike. And when they decide to swap clothes just to see what it would feel like to be the other person, everyone around them starts mistaking one for the other. When the prince proclaims his true identity despite his raggedy clothes, everyone laughs at him. And when Tom starts being treated like the prince he's now dressed as, he is mighty confused. Meanwhile in Texas, Joe gets the opportunity to meet his new team, the team he will now be helping to coach. And while he's doing his best to coach them, the girls are getting distracted by Wishbone, by each other, by the grass. David's dad encourages Joe to have patience. But it seems like this job is way tougher than Joe thought it would be. Tom gets a similar wake-up call when he starts taking on the duties of a prince. All the small things in life are now taken care of for him, which he's not used to at all. But he's cooped up in the castle all day long, unable to play, unable to enjoy being a young boy, which previously he was able to do even if his life was hard before. Things escalate when King Henry dies, making the Prince of Wales the new king, aka making Tom the new king for the moment. Back in the modern storyline, Joe finds out that David's dad has to go out of town on business at the very last minute. So Joe will be coaching the season opener all by himself. Unsurprisingly, the game is rough going, and Joe even gets a taste of a parent being ticked off by the performance, as if Joe could be expected to turn a team of 5-year-old girls into professional athletes. Everyone races to Joe's defense, and it's actually Wishbone who gets the game back on track. Joe gets his head back in the game, and Wishbone helps direct the girls around the bases, leading their team to victory. Then finally, in the story adaptation, everyone still thinks the real Prince of Wales is crazy, claiming that he's royalty when he's dressed still like the beggar Tom. But when the prince finds out that his father has died, that he is the new king, he races to the palace just in time for the coronation. There's a test issued to both of the boys in order to see who's the real deal. They both have to draw the royal seal, and when only the real Prince of Wales draws it correctly, he is crowned the rightful king. So let's talk about this episode. Right away, comparing it against the book, I actually just read the book for the very first time, there are a number of inconsistencies. And this is pretty typical for Wishbone, especially when they're taking on a book, like a full-length book. There's just too much for them to include every single plot point, every single part of a book when they're pushing it into a half-hour episode, but more than that, they're pushing it into 15 minutes of a half-hour episode because of the two different storylines. So I expected that they would trim some things, and they definitely did. For instance, we don't get to meet the king before his death, which was kind of a shame because the king's scene, his very first scene with Tom, who is dressed as the Prince of Wales, that's my favorite part of the book. That wasn't included. I can see why, just for the sake of time. Also, there's no mention of Miles Hendon, who helps out the prince while he's undercover, and that was surprising that he wasn't in there. He's a pretty important character in the book. And on that note, we also don't get to see any adventures of the prince, if you want to call them that. While he's dressed in Tom's clothes, he doesn't have an easy go of it. Tom doesn't have an easy life, so as you would expect, things don't go great for the prince, especially because he keeps telling everyone that he is royalty. I mean, at one point, he's locked up in prison. We also don't get to see Tom's struggles in the palace, how he was telling everybody that he's not the prince, and so everyone thought that he too had either lost his mind or at the very least suffered some kind of memory loss. And I think most importantly, what we don't get to see from either of them is them getting used to their respective stations, like coming to be used to the circumstances they now find themselves in and making the best of that and really learning from those experiences. The moral message that the writers of this episode pulled out of The Prince and the Pauper is a very straightforward one. It is very much a the grass is not always greener type of message. You may think things on the other side are super simple. I would love to live that life, but it's not as easy as you think. And that is more or less what the book communicates. But the show's version of it is definitely a simplification of what is in the book. Because the book shows things like the Prince of Wales now being exposed to the types of lives that his subjects lead. And so we're led to believe that he's going to be a more generous, more in touch, more gracious king because he got to live the life of a subject of his. But then on the other hand, we get to see Tom kind of expose the excesses of court life because he's presented with all of these numbers, these huge amounts of money that he's never seen before, and he's able to say things like, why are we spending more than what's coming in? Obviously, the modern storyline was going for that same, it is not as easy as it looks type of thing. That boasting, though, that he could do such a better job than the coach, I found that to be a little bit out of character for Joe. Joe is a very down-to-earth guy, honestly a little bit timid at times, so it was kind of weird hearing that come from him. But I do think that teens and preteens can sometimes think that something is so easy. And it is so easy just to say, oh, I would have done that so much better. And then when you get the opportunity, you realize it's a lot tougher than you thought it was going to be, and you don't really want the job after all. That's a pretty timeless lesson for everybody, really. And even though I'm happy that the T-ball game turned around, Joe's team won, that's awesome. I can't say I loved how the game got turned around because there shouldn't be a dog on the fields. Wishbone would not have been allowed to be on the field. That's unsafe. That's against the rules. And the coach of the opposite team would have rightfully thrown a fit. Like, they would have been screaming. I just don't think it's the best message either that Joe needs to resort to using his pet, or at the very least allowing his pet to interfere in things that he's trying to do. I would have really liked to see Joe finding a way to keep the girls focused without Wishbone being involved. But overall, I thought this was a pretty fun episode. It was certainly a lot of fun seeing two different Wishbones on the screen at one time in different outfits, and they did a pretty good editing job considering how old of an episode this is. And really, I liked their take on The Prince and the Pauper. I liked it in its short form. Maybe this is a controversial opinion, but since I just read the book for the first time, I think the book would have made a much better short story. It just kind of kept going on, and I think the story would have been a lot better. It would have communicated a lot more effectively had it been tighter. So I like The Prince and the Pauper in its short form. I think this adaptation would have been close to perfect had they included just a few more elements of the story, like the boys in each other's shoes, learning from these different experiences, taking that back to their lives, who they were before they swapped places. I think it would have been perfect then. Except this episode didn't include one big takeaway from the book that you will get if you read the book for sure. And that is, look the part, be the part. But that was my take on this episode of Wishbone. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to leave those in the comment section below. And if you would like to keep up with what I am reading and writing about right now, you can find me on a variety of places around the internet, including social media sites like Goodreads and Instagram, the two places where I'm the most active. The links to everywhere you can find me will be at the bottom of the description box below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.
Funding for Wishbone provided by annual financial support from PBS viewers like you.